released from academia. So I'm going to be running some fairly complex terminology by you this morning. Just remember, in practical everyday use, it comes down to that word, listen, particularly when we're inclined to hurry on and not listen. Okay. I'm going to talk about two worthy ideals this morning, accountability and intentionality. In a very real sense, they go together. And I contend that good intentions are worth little without accountability. We need to understand both. We need to understand what accountability is, moment by moment and day by day. And to explain, I'll start with a troubling story. Back in 1993, two young black men were waiting at a bus stop in London, England. 6 white teenagers on the other side of the street began to shout at them. And one of the black men, Dwayne Brooks, got scared and began to run. And then, to Brooks's horror, the young white men charged across the street, caught Brooks's friend, Stephen Lawrence, and stabbed him to death. Police quickly arrived, and I believe the officers did intend to solve the crime. Good intentions, but they assumed they already knew what had happened, a gang fight. They assumed that rather than being the victims of deadly violence, the two black men had been participants equally responsible for the violence inflicted upon them. And while the police were interrogating Dwayne Brooks, the murderers got clean away. Witnesses came forward to explain what had really happened. It turned out that the white gang had been on a rampage attacking black people that whole evening. And even so, 20 years went by before the murderers were even brought to trial. And it was so messed up, Parliament called for an inquiry, and they found that the officers had violated their own protocols. They had failed to provide aid to the crime victims. Dwayne Brooks had tried to tell them what happened, but they ignored his information. In philosophical terms, Brooks was a knower. He knew what had happened. But because of bias against him as a black man, police refused to listen. The inquiry found that the root cause was, of course, entrenched structural racism in London's police force. And with structural racism, like a lot of structural isms, good intentions are not the problem. But officers did not allow people of color respect as knowers due to biased feelings, which many officers probably didn't even realize they had. And of course, this sort of thing happens all the time. On both sides of the Atlantic, black citizens here in the United States complain that they are treated differently by police, by other agencies, and even by the medical establishment. And as a devoted reader of Scientific American magazine, scientific research has confirmed that those complaints are, in fact, accurate. Nor does this kind of unequal treatment apply just to black people. The same prejudices play out in various forms for all people of color, as well as for gender nonconforming people, people with disabilities, and still, all too often, women. Feminist philosopher Miranda Fricker tells the story about Dwayne Brooks and Stephen Lawrence as an example of what she calls testimonial epistemic injustice. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we learn, what we learn, and in this case, what we think we know that is just not true, but which prevents us from finding out what we need to know. Testimonial epistemic injustice. Those are big words, but they describe a very common part of the human experience. The human brain uses unconscious shortcuts all the time to process input and make decisions. But because we do this unconsciously, we too often do find ourselves acting on cultural assumptions rather than facts. And in the case of the Stephen Lawrence murder, biased police assumptions, because this had been a gang fight, because the stereotype is that all black men are violent, prevented them from listening to the real facts about the crime. Good intentions don't mean much without accountability. Unitarian Universalism is a strongly covenantal tradition, but I submit that our covenantal declarations are not worth much without accountability. So, again, what is accountability? Unitarian Universalist theologian James Luther Adams taught that a covenant is a sincere ethical promise willingly entered into by equals, and it is rooted in love, not law. Violation of a covenant is a problem not because it breaks an enforceable law, but because it is a violation of trust. It is a breach of faith. Okay, covenantal relationship is rooted in love, not law. So again, if we're talking about love instead of law, what does accountability mean for us? And to me, accountability means this: we need to listen to people who are treated unfairly, whether it be an individual in an unequal relationship or a whole population. People of color, LGBTQ plus people, people with disabilities, and let's not forget old people and women. That's all testimonial, epistemic justice really is. Listen to marginalized voices. Listen, pay attention, especially when it seems like somebody that it's really easy to ignore. And I've done it too. There is another kind of epistemic injustice, what Miranda Fricker calls hermeneutical epistemic injustice, and that's harder to explain. In philosophy, hermeneutics is the science of interpretation, and Fricker applies this to knowledge and information. And knowledge and information can very much be a justice issue. For example, suppose the people in a poor section of town don't have the information they need to register to vote. If they don't, then their right to vote has in effect been taken away. That lack of knowledge is hermeneutic epistemic injustice, and therefore, working to provide that information is an act of hermeneutic justice. One more subtle example of hermeneutic injustice comes from Miranda Fricker herself, and she shared in it. She writes about the beloved American novel and the movie made from the novel, To Kill a Mockingbird, as an example of testimonial injustice. And I think I preached on this here a year or two ago, so I'm going to review it just as a reminder. A black man, Tom Robinson, in the novel is accused of assaulting a white woman in 1930s Alabama. Both he and the novel's hero, Atticus Finch, explain to the jury how that could not have happened, but the racist jury refuses to listen to them and convicts him anyway. That's testimonial injustice. They won't listen. But To Kill a Mockingbird itself and the way Fricker uses it are also a perfect example of hermeneutic injustice. For the record, film critic Roger Ebert savaged the movie because of the way the movie and also the book treated its black characters. They have no life or function of their own other than, as Ebert puts it, to act as props, quote, backdrops in a story about a brave white liberal, Atticus Finch. And that assessment of both the book and the movie is probably still shocking to some people even today. When I first preached about it in the early 2000s, I got strong pushback From a lot of people, it was very difficult to explain convincingly the kind of self-righteous liberal racism that really does pervade both the book and the movie. And in her writing on epistemic injustice, Miranda Fricker also fails to recognize that structural racism. That's how slippery this stuff can be. She's the expert, but she missed it too. Roger Ebert caught it. He was married to a black woman. I'm pretty sure she helped him on that. He listened to his wife. Yay for him, for whatever that's worth. Okay. Then came groundbreaking black film director Spike Lee, who coined language to explain what was going on. The black handyman, Tom Robinson, is what Lee calls a magical Negro. The magical Negro is only there to help develop a story about the white hero. In To Kill a Mockingbird, once Tom Robinson has done that job, the plot conveniently kills him off. And none of the white characters worry very much about that. He was never more than a prop. His death doesn't matter to the book's outcome or the movie's. Meanwhile, the character of Atticus Finch, the heroic white lawyer, is what Lee calls a white savior. The black characters in the story cannot help themselves. Both the novel and the movie assume there were no black lawyers in the United States in the 1930s. So the white hero bravely steps in to try to save Tom Robinson. For the record, there were black law schools and there were black lawyers. They might have, for example, asked future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. He was, during this novel's time frame, just starting out as a crusading civil rights lawyer, and a black lawyer running that case would totally have changed the story. But the book and the movie just ignored that possibility. Didn't even occur to him, I'm quite sure. Okay. Magical Negroes and white saviors are now recognized as racist cliches. But when Ebert wrote his review, and later on when I was first trying to preach about it, that language didn't yet exist to explain those concepts. And Miranda Fricker herself doesn't pick up on it. That's what hermeneutical injustice is. It's a void in necessary knowledge about a justice issue. Now, for the record, To Kill a Mockingbird is a wonderful book, and it's a fine movie, and both were arguably as anti-racist as they could be in the early 1960s and still be accepted at all. But looking back, we can now see that both are examples how something can be anti-racist on one level and yet by centering all its white characters reinforce structural racism at a deeper level. Now, we're learning more about this stuff all the time, and that's what hermeneutic justice is. Which brings us to something else Miranda Fricker talks about, and it's not even three-syllable words, yay. And it's essential to epistemic justice, what she calls the right to contest, the right to be heard if you believe you've been unfairly treated. The right to contest, she tells us, fundamentally changes a relationship. The more powerful person in the relationship may have good intentions, but they will behave differently if they're accountable for their actions toward the less powerful person. Intentionality requires good intentions plus accountability. They need to go together. There's no anchor otherwise. Now, there's a tension between the right to contest on one side and what Fricker calls a culture of domination. That if you don't have the right to contest, you have a culture of domination. One example she uses is in the United Kingdom, a law passed decades ago that made marital rape a crime. And she explains that even in a marriage where the husband would never even think of committing marital rape, that law changed the institution of marriage. It weakened the patriarchal culture of domination and granted women a greater right to contest across the board. And again, I apologize that we have to struggle with these big words and academic language, but these are really basic, deeply personal issues, and they play out every day all around us. The new Article 2 language in our Unitarian Universalist Association bylaws says, in part, quote, "Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love," close quote. So, what's accountability? What's spiritual discipline? We are accountable to one another. And this brings us right back to epistemic justice, because that's what accountability is in a covenantal relationship, practicing epistemic justice, honoring the right to contest by listening to marginalized voices. And those voices have much to teach, both in society and within our own religious tradition. And we can live into the fact that there always is more for us to learn. I think it's easy to forget sometimes that nationwide, we Unitarian Universalists have thousands of members who are Asian, Hispanic, Indigenous, and or Black. We have thousands of LGBTQ plus members. We have thousands of members with disabilities. And we need to listen to those experiences too. We need to listen to that knowledge. And we haven't always done that as well as we might. We're working at it. We're getting better. In an article about epistemic justice, Mexican sociologist Sylvia Schmelkes writes, quote, "The notion of lifelong, life-wide learning presupposes acknowledging the existence of very diverse sources of knowledge, many ways of knowing, and the need for dialogue as the principal method for ensuring both deep learning and personal and collective growth. Okay, dialogue, that's both speaking and listening. Okay, you don't have dialogue unless both parties are willing to do it. Diversity, dialogue, and personal and collective growth. Isn't that precisely what we tell people we're about? In other words, to honor and engage the pluralism and diversity we already have calls for epistemic justice toward members and would-be members, particularly those outside what we might sometimes view as our cultural mainstream. If I say something hurtful toward, say, a transgender person or a person of color or toward a woman, and I have done, it wasn't intentional, but it still happened. They should have the right to tell me so, the right to contest. What are my good intentions worth if I don't take time to listen? And to me, that's a crucial part of what accountability means in a covenantal relationship. And to me, that is an ethical call. As a totally Northern European descended lifelong member of the Mid-America vanilla set, I am called to be curious, to be interested in learning about people with different life experiences from myself. Covenantal accountability ethically calls me to listen to people unlike myself, particularly people on the margins. Epistemic justice. And to me, if I practice that, all the other pieces begin to fall into place. 200 years ago, Reverend William Ellery Channing was the leading Unitarian intellectual of his day. In fact, he gave us our name. He preached the sermon Unitarian Christianity, which got the ball rolling in 1821. Well, he wrote a whole book on the hottest moral issue of his time, slavery. And frankly, it's hard to read that book today without gagging. Channing had good intentions. He opposed slavery on philosophical grounds. He knew something was wrong with it. But he also accepted every rationalization for slavery that white slaveholders gave him. Brilliant though Channing was, it never occurred to him to ask an enslaved person what slavery was like. His good intentions fell on barren ground because he was still part of an American culture of domination in which enslaved people had no right to contest, no right to describe how they felt about slavery or how it affected them. People are the experts on their own lives. William Ellery Channing, kind-hearted, well-intentioned, brilliant man though he was, didn't think about what an enslaved person would know about their own lives that he didn't already know. That wasn't the only time he did it either. He did it to construction workers. I've done that, so I picked up on that too. We 21st century Unitarian Universalists are not immune to that. The Unitarian Universalist Association had a huge blow-up over unequal hiring practices back in 2017. And I submit that it blew up precisely because people of color at that time had no way to contest sloppy, unequal hiring practices. It wasn't about good intentions. We had the best intentions, but the human condition is that, like Channing, we don't know what it is that we don't know until we give marginalized people an opportunity to tell us. So, to avoid a culture of domination, whether it's intentional or not, I must pay attention when someone tells me how my actions affected their life. Accountability. We all need to remember to listen when someone tells us about their life. We need to help one another listen. In Scientific American's terms, to get back to that little quote, we must stand up for the silenced and stand with the silence breakers, even when they're talking to us. Learning new stuff is actually one of the coolest things we human beings do. I love what happens when we take a hard look at how we've always done things and see where we could do better. In covenantal relationship terms with our own diversity, the study of epistemic justice gives Unitarian Universalists a language to understand what we've been groping at for the last several decades, trying to better communicate with and accommodate marginalized voices within our own tradition and in society at large. And our understanding of the world always is evolving. Shame on us if it doesn't. We need to evolve with it. And you can put this in the bank. Society's biggest problems come when people fail to adapt to new information. 2 words: climate change. Society's biggest problems come when people fail to adapt to new information. And that's epistemic justice in a nutshell. So here's to evolution. May we continue to evolve as our knowledge and language evolve. Amen. May it be so.